Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about training to failure. Now, failure training is a hotly debated topic in bodybuilding, and it's something that I thought a lot about as an intermediate bodybuilder, so we'll shed some light on the topic. Training to failure is actually a very complex issue, so make sure you watch the entire video to see all the perspectives before you make up your mind on it. Quick outline for today, we'll be talking about failure training in the context of maximizing muscle growth for natural bodybuilding. We'll start off with talking about the pros, then we'll move on to the cons, and lastly we'll put everything together and I'll give you my recommendations on whether you should train to failure. If you've been enjoying my content so far, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's get right into it. Alright, let's start off with the pros of training to failure. First of all, training to failure gives you a high degree of stimulus. One way you can think about this is that you're making sure that you exhaust all of your muscle fibers. And for that reason, if you're very short on time, it's actually a very effective way to train for hypertrophy. Here it's important for us to understand that there's a trade-off between volume and relative intensity when it comes to hypertrophy training. By volume, we're talking about sets times reps times weight lifted, and relative intensity is how close you go to failure. Throughout bodybuilding history, there have typically been two different approaches that people take when it comes to relative intensity. You have people who train with low volumes and take everything to failure, or train with very high relative intensities. And then you have people who go for a lower relative intensity approach, so they'll leave a couple reps in the tank, but they'll do much more volume. The issue we run into is that our bodies are limited by the amount of fatigue that's produced with high intensity training. So if you do train to failure, you're just not going to be able to get through as much productive volume as you would otherwise. Moving on with some more pros, training to failure ensures that you're training hard enough. It's been shown that beginner athletes are actually very bad at estimating how close they are to failure. So if you told them to leave 2 reps in the tank, they may actually be much further from that in reality. The scientific consensus right now is that as long as you're within about 4 reps shy of failure, you're going to be getting a good hypertrophy stimulus. However, if you're just estimating how many reps you have left in the tank, you might end up missing that range, and you just might end up not training intensely enough. So this can actually be helpful for some people, especially beginners, because training to failure gives you a hard endpoint to let you know that you've hit a standardized amount of relative intensity. That's not to say that you need to train to failure all the time to get this benefit. As long as you incorporate it in some semi-regular way, it'll help give you a sense of your RIR, or repetitions in reserve. What I mean is that even if you do most of your training with 1 or 2 reps left in the tank, as long as you go to failure once in a while, it'll give you that check. Next point here is that advanced athletes may require an extreme stimulus to see results. This is based on anecdote, so it's a weak level of evidence, but typically as athletes become more advanced, they require a greater stimulus to grow, which might necessitate more extreme measures. I want to emphasize that if you're in your first 1 or 2 years of training, this really isn't an issue, and you're going to be getting lots of hypertrophy even if you don't go to failure. The last point here, which is actually a very important one, is that some people might respond better to failure training. This comes down to a lot of factors, including genetics, but in my opinion, some people just respond better to a lower volume, higher intensity approach than others. Okay, now that we've talked about the pros, let's move on to the cons of training to failure. The first one is that training to failure is highly fatiguing, and fatigue goes up out of proportion to stimulus. We said in the pro section that reps closer to failure produce a higher stimulus for hypertrophy, but if you look at the amount of fatigue that those same reps produce, the fatigue will actually go up in a more exponential manner. What that means is if you want to squeeze out that very last rep and go to failure, you will get an incremental increase in hypertrophy stimulus. However, you will also get a disproportionate amount of increased fatigue. This is the core of the argument that most of the scientific community has against training to failure all the time, because it will reduce the amount of total volume within your workout and across workouts. If you're trained to failure on every set in a workout, you're going to fatigue very quickly, and it will drop the number of sets and reps that you're able to perform on subsequent sets. You also probably won't be able to complete as many sets as you would if you stayed a couple reps shy of failure. It's important to note, however, that fatigue doesn't just apply within one workout, but also affects your subsequent workouts. So if you smashed a really intense session on Monday and you come back to train the same muscle group a few days later, your performance on subsequent workouts will be reduced if you push yourself too hard. As we talked about in my volume video, the total amount of productive volume that you're able to produce is actually probably the most important training variable when it comes to hypertrophy. So it's really important that we take fatigue into account when looking at our programming. Moving on to some more cons, there's actually some evidence against training to failure all the time. The other thing is that going all the way to failure may encourage technique breakdown. Leading off of the technique breakdown, there's also a higher risk of injury when you train to failure, which is more so on major compound movements like squat, bench, or deadlift. Alright, so now that we've talked about the pros and the cons of training to failure, let's put everything together and give you some recommendations. My current stance is that you should avoid training to failure on all sets. The scientific consensus right now is against training to failure all the time, and I think it makes sense because of the trade-off with productive volume. My current recommendation for relative intensity is to aim for 1 to 2 reps in reserve on most of your sets. And you should be thinking about how to maximize productive volume across your workout and across your training cycle. Now, the major exception to this is that if you're short on time. In this case, it actually makes sense to train to failure because you're going to get all of the stimulus you can out of those sets, and you wouldn't have time to pack in more volume anyways. So what do I mean by short on time? This is hard to say exactly because it depends on individual factors and different people require different amounts of volume. The way to think about this is that if you feel that you need more volume to progress and you don't have time to fit in that volume, then it might make sense to train to failure to get the most out of the training that you do perform. Now, if you are going to train to failure, it's best used on the last set of the last exercise for a muscle group. As we said before, a big disadvantage of training to failure is that if you do it early on in a workout, it'll actually limit you from performing well later on in the workout. So the solution for this is to save it for the very last set of a muscle group for that workout. So for example, if your bicep workout is 3 sets of hammer curls followed by 3 sets of barbell curls, you would save training to failure for the very last set of barbell curls. Now, I actually do recommend training to failure on a semi-regular basis. And my thought is that you should use it in the last week before deloading. Training to failure leads to a lot of fatigue that can limit your performance in subsequent workouts and subsequent weeks of training. However, if your next week is going to be a deload week, you may as well train to failure to maximize the stimulus that you get, because you're going to have a week of recovery coming up anyways, and your body will be able to dissipate that fatigue. I think the bottom line with this is that you need to try it out yourself and see if it works better for you. Even with all the pros and cons we talked about, I still feel that there are some people who respond better to a lower volume, higher relative intensity approach, and other people who respond to more volume. I do feel that theoretically a higher volume approach where you leave 1 to 2 reps in the tank is going to be better for hypertrophy overall, but I think the issue is most people don't have time to train 5 or 6 days a week to accumulate that much volume. Last couple of points on training to failure here. You should be really trying to be strict with your training form. I would define failure as lifting to the point where you can't complete another rep with good form. The other thing I would say is don't use it on major compound movements like squat, bench, and deadlift. For big movements like that, the risk of injury is just too high, and there's really no reason to miss reps on those exercises. Failure training is better suited for isolation movements and machine movements. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like the video and leave me a comment below. I'm really good about answering every single one of my comments, so you'll definitely hear back from me. In particular, do you train to failure, and how often do you do it? Let me know below. If you want to learn how to optimize your training program for hypertrophy, check out my book on AskDrSwole.com, where I give some sample programs based on the upper-lower split, and more importantly, go through all the different variables required for optimal training programming and how to modify them to produce optimal results for you. The concepts I talk about in the book will apply to all training programs, so I think it's going to be a valuable read. If you haven't already, check out my Basics of Training series, where I go through the different training variables and give you some recommendations for optimized hypertrophy. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't, and if you're getting value from my videos, share the channel with your fitness friends so they can benefit from it too. See you next time.